why are we doing assessments? Assessments are always given to you to give you the opportunity to express your understanding of what you're learning. So demonstrating your understanding via the assessments. Then we give you this mark, 60%, 70%, 50%, whatever it is. And then that's what goes towards your degree. Okay. And it's important when you're demonstrating your understanding that to do that, then perhaps understanding your module learning outcomes becomes important. And we will look at those learning outcomes because they always relate to the assessment. Because the assessment relates to the module, it will relate to the module learning outcomes. And also that all of this helps you, as I say, frame your assessment. So it absolutely uncovers what it is precisely that you've been asked to do. So you have a question, but when you look at the question and the learning outcomes between the two, then you have a really good understanding of what's involved. Okay. So, yeah, so we're going to look at understanding the question, the types of question, you know, the fact that there are three elements to a question: task, words, topic, focus. That there are little things, small things with big implications, little words or comment or things that can be added into a question that you might skip over, but in actual fact, you have to pay close attention to. And then how at the end of all of that, once you understand the question, then you create more questions. And that's what allows you to access developing an answer. That's what allows you to answering those further questions. I'll make sense of that when I get to it. And then how you'll do reading, planning in a kind of, in a cycle rather than you do the reading and you do the planning. Okay. So yeah, very briefly, before, when you were answering a question, and I want you to make this key difference, before when you were asked a question at college, or you were given a question at school, secondary, whatever, you could basically, the marker is looking to you to mention certain things, literally talk about this, talk about this, talk about this, talk about this, and we'll give you marks for that. And everybody goes home happy. So you're thinking about recalling. But at university, the difference is the question is too particular for you to randomly throw stuff in as an answer. So there's, you know, sometimes you say in an exam when you're stuck, what I did was I wrote everything I knew. I just wrote everything down and hoped that I would get marks. It's just that that's not going to work here. And sometimes when people write the accident, it's not on purpose, but accidentally they don't write the relevant stuff to the question. So they'll put stuff in the essay and it doesn't get them any marks because it's not relevant. It's part of the module. It may be part of the general gist of what we've been asked to do, but there are things in the question that are too specific to allow you to talk about everything. So by accident, you may put in stuff that's not relevant. And of course, relevance is one of the key things in academic writing. So understanding the question is the key to making everything you write as relevant as possible. Therefore, ticking that box in terms of the 5 things. Okay. So the first thing we're going to look at is task words. You know, they shape an assessment. They are, you know, they're instructions that influence the content and the structure of an essay or a report. I believe we will be talking about a report here, but any piece of academic writing, it influences it. So let's look at some. and there's a few. Holy moly, we have to put them. There's many. We have to put them in alphabetical order, right? And I'm just going to skip forward to the next slide and say, there's 2 pages and we've not even got to E yet, or we've just got to E, sorry. Right, so there's one I want to identify here. or basically, I just want to say these are all different, right? Compare, identify the similarities and differences. Sorry, let me get my identify the similarities and differences. So that's comparing, which is different from assess, which is to weigh up to what extent something is true, which is different to clarify, which is literally making something clearer and, where appropriate, simplify. So if you're asked to clarify rather than compare, you're doing something different in the essay. So the whole vibe of the essay changes. So you've got to look at the task word, you've got to identify the task word, and then which is basically what have you been asked to do. So I'll move on to the next one. Critically evaluate is one. Sorry, I just want to briefly go back to this one. So what I do is I've simplified compare, and I've identified it. When I see the word compare, immediately my mind jumps to similarities and differences. How are these two things or three things or however many things, how are they similar and how are they different? So, you know, the difference between a car and a bus. A car and a bus are similar because they're modes of transport. They transport people. The differences are one's carries a lot more people than the other one. It's run as a business. The other one is much smaller and it's privately owned generally. So that's it. Similarities and differences. Critically evaluate is, give your verdict as to what extent a statement or findings within a piece of research are true, or to what extent you agree with them. Okay, so you're asked to critically evaluate something. You know, provide evidence that both agrees and contradicts an argument. Come to find, but my shorthand for this is when I see critically evaluate, I just see give something a score out of 10 with words. So I would say if I agree with something, I would give it 9 out of 10. If I didn't like it, I would give it 1 out of 10. And again, for that, with that in mind, I would like you in the chat box. I'm going to ask you 2 questions about something, and I want you to give me that score out of 10 for each question. So the first question is, how well do you think the NHS has coped with, or the staff, how well have the staff in the NHS dealt with COVID so far? If you were to give them the staff of the NHS a score out of 10, what would you give them for the work they've put in for COVID? And that's all I'm looking for, you to type in a number. Right, 9, 10. Okay, brilliant. So 10 out of 10, difficult job, unprecedented. So there you go. And thanks, Sheila. And Sheila's put in the reason, which is the justification for it. And that's it. So if you were doing an essay, you would drop the 10 out of 10 bit, but you would just put in the written part where you say it's a difficult job in unprecedented circumstances. But you're right, 10 out of 10. Now, here's another thing. So the other thing is there's general agreement. Everybody's giving them a high score because generally we can all agree on roughly how it's been and how well they've done. You know, it's obvious from the news, from what we've read in the papers. We can gather evidence. We're not just saying 9 or 10 out of nowhere, but we have evidence for it. So the next question is, how well do you think the Conservative government, Boris Johnson in particular, how well do you think they've handled the pandemic? A score out of 10. Complete agreement that you don't give them any marks. So they've made, arguably what you're saying with that is they've made a complete arse of it almost every step of the way, which it'd be difficult to disagree with. And you could get all the things and you could get the evidence and you could do that. So that, and so critical evaluation, that is basically what it is. We can all do it. We could all do it based on, but when we ask you to critically evaluate, which is one of the most common assessments at university, it's the same thing, but it's the evidence you have to work out, rather than it being something that's, the examples I've given you, you've been immersed in, you've been given that evidence through the news, through newspapers and everything all the time. So it's been easy to do, but for this, you're going to have to develop that understanding of whether something's a good thing, a positive thing, an effective thing, or it's a negative, damaging, causes problems type thing. But it's basically giving something a score out of 10 with words rather than with numbers. So when you write the essay, if you write the essay about the NHS staff, that essay is going to be full of positives with maybe some negatives, because that's the way it breaks down. You will try and find the positives and the negatives, but the positives will far outweigh. And then when you do the thing about the Tory government, arguably, it's going to be full of negatives with very few positives. So, and there's other ones. And I think what the next slide said is, the thing is that you have to understand them. You could Google task words or university task words or essay task words, and you'll get lots of different versions with different meanings. The important thing is to understand one, and like I think, always try and get your own meaning. So I'm similarities and differences. I'm a score of 9 out of 10 in words, and then that helps me, and then I can locate them. Okay. So there's a couple of other words that sometimes sneak their way into questions, and one is you might say comment. You might get the question that says discuss the performance of the Tory government on the pandemic and comment on their actions. Now that comment, all I'm saying is that comment is not, it's not a descriptive comment. It's an evaluation. So it's an assessment. So it's comment it's did they do it good? Did they do it bad? Yeah, they got this wrong, they got this wrong, they got this wrong. That's your comment. It's not, when you say comment on the government, it's not say, well, there's 600 MPs and they all go to the House of Commons. For me, that comment is like, that's where they're telling you to do a critical analysis, but they're doing it in a very subtle way. Right, illustrate just means use examples. So what's your examples? Well, they didn't do this, they didn't shut down, they didn't do this, they didn't do that. They were wasteful. And here's an example. Also around theory, you can use examples. So you might have a theory that says social marketing is becoming more common. And then you give an example of something happening on Twitter or Facebook that reflects that. And that's an example of some other comment. So make sure every word is considered. So now what I want to do is look at task words and questions. And we've discussed two of them. So compare and contrast the 3 dimensions of power identified by Stephen Lukes in terms of their potential to influence this political sphere. So I've picked out the task words first here. So you've got, compare and contrast, which we know similarities and differences. And then we've got this middle one, which is to what extent do you agree with this statement? In other words, how true is it? Now, that, funnily enough, it's not that different from a critical evaluation. It's just a different way of doing it. So when it says, to what extent do you agree with it? You could only come to that opinion if you've critically evaluated it and found out if it's true or not. So the fact that the comment, to what extent, always follows a statement. So the statement here is an assertion, it's a claim. The Gaelic revival was the most important factor in advancing separatist nationalism. So all you have to do is to say, well, where's all the evidence that it was the most important factor? And where's the evidence that something else was more important or that was not as important? And then once you've done all of that, you can say, in the essay, you can say, by the evidence provided, it is fairly clear or obvious that it was the most important factor or it wasn't the most. And that's, to me, it's another way of saying critically evaluate, but it's understanding that to what extent do you agree with, you've got to work out how true something is. And it's usually a statement. The third one is the critically evaluate. So it's this 9 out of 10, sorry, 9 out of 10. Give a score out of 10 for the direct and indirect effects of Donald Trump's executive order, blah, blah, blah. So this one, we're giving a 9 out of 10. Sorry, we're giving a score out of 10. Why do I keep saying 9 out of 10? We give a score out of 10 for that. So then we're going to look at the next part. Now, the next part is the topic of the question. So that's the topic of the question is a bigger thing. So all questions have this big thing. So the big thing in the question is, part of this question is the 3 dimensions of power identified by Stephen Lukes. Now, you don't need to understand what that was. You don't, I'm not asking you, we're not going to look at that, but I'm just saying that's the big bit. And I'm able to establish that that's the topic and that's important. So that will have play some part in your answer. And then the next one for question 2, it's the Gaelic or Gaelic revival, which is the big topic, the big thing. And then for the third one, I think it's Donald Trump's executive order is the big thing to be talked about. So these are the things that are the kind of bigger things that have to be talked about. And these, generally the topic in a question is a topic in the module. It may relate to a lecture or a couple of lectures or a group of lectures, but there'll be this big thing. So for you, it might be garment construction, it may be fashion trends, it may be something like that, but it's that kind of general topic. So identify that so you know that's the kind of the general area that this essay or whatever is going to, or this report or whatever is going to be in. But then the next one is the focus. Now the focus pinpoints the thing that makes the question more specific. And it's what I call it frames it. So it says that although we're talking about the 3 dimensions of power of the Gaelic revival of Donald Trump, the thing is, the important bit is one, its potential to influence the political sphere. So the first question, we're only comparing, contrasting these things in the way that they influence politics. No other way. Nothing else they do is important. Nothing else is relevant. Okay. When we talk about the Gaelic revival, we're not necessarily getting into any great detail about the revival itself, but the question is specifically asking, was it the most important factor? Was it the thing that drove on separatist nationalism or not? Some people say it did, some people didn't say it. What do you think? And then for the next one, when we talk about this, it's Donald Trump's executive order. And to give you a little bit of background, this was when Donald Trump kind of basically banned people from foreign countries coming to the US. And this question is not asking when he banned them, how many people he banned them, but what he's saying, what they're asking here is what were the direct and indirect effects of it on America, on the people traveling? What were the direct and indirect effects of this travel ban? So that's a focus. So there's always a focus in a question you should look out for that says, if you talk about other stuff about the things in blue, the topics, they may not be relevant to the question and may not get you marks, because the question will always have a specific point that makes it. That's what we're looking at. So at this point, I want to go on and actually discuss one of the questions you've been given. And using the system we've used before, break down that question. So here we have, the question is a critical assessment of the success of the event's PR strategy. So this is from the Introduction to Public Relations module. And part of that is an essay or an assessment of, funnily enough, a PR company's event strategy. So obviously, if we just go through, it's a critical assessment. We've talked about, although it says critical assessment, it's the same as all the others. It's looking for this, giving something a score out of 10 using words. The general topic of the question is an event's PR strategy. So you've got to look at and identify a company's PR strategy. But the focus of the question is the success. So how successful was it? Basically on a scale of 1 to 10, and justify what you're saying. Okay, so, and there's a really useful part underneath which just says, I mean, it's really instructive, it's useful to talk about. Provide an analysis of why you think the event was and or was not successful. What sort of evidence can you find in the media to support your views? So in one respect, you will be providing an analysis from the theory, but there may be reports in the media about an event that say whether or not they felt that that was a success or not. The importance or the challenge with this is finding the evidence of what the actual strategy that they used was. At this point, I want to link this to the module learning outcomes and assessments to help you frame and to help you understand what they're looking for. So there's 2 of the module learning outcomes which you can look at and you can see in the module handbook that are definitely related to what you're trying to do here. So the first one is, this module says it's going to, by the end of this module, if you're successful, you'll be able to analyse and assess the effectiveness of public relations, promotional strategies and tactics. So in other words, this module is giving you the ability to analyse and assess. So to answer this question, it's all wrapped up in what the module's trying to do for you. So think about that and try and think back or look forward to the lectures that are related to these module outcomes. Now, the second module learning outcome is that you'll be able to demonstrate familiarity with some of the appropriate practical skills, techniques, and tools required to produce an outline public relations campaign. So, again, there's something wrapped up in what they're telling you is that you should be able to identify what's been used within the strategy you've been asked to assess, and also you should be able to identify or be able to analyse what has made it successful or what has made it unsuccessful. Then, if I move on to the weekly syllabus, it's not strictly speaking lectures per se, but it's what they're doing each week. These ones in green, and I'm not saying it's all of them, but definitely the ones in green are going to be really important, that when you go to these lectures, all I'm saying is go in with maybe questions you've got in mind about your assessment and try and pick out, as the lecturer's talking to you or as you go back and see the recordings of these lectures, there will be real links, real things that will throw up the foundation of what your answer might be. And that's the key thing, that you relate. This is how it's important to relate the question to your module learning outcomes in the lectures, so that you know there will definitely be things in these lectures that will be very useful to you as you try and plan and start to answer the question that you've been given. So let's start to develop our plan. And by my mind, that's for example, that's creating more questions. So you've got your basic question, which is critically assess how well this PR campaign was done. Now, for me, one immediate question is, what are the things? What are the things that would make a PR campaign successful? That's the very first thing I want to know, because then I'll be looking for, within the campaign that's been done, does it have any of these? Does it not have any of these? And then the second thing would be, what are the challenges in planning and implementing a PR campaign? In other words, what is somebody up against that may make it difficult for them to actually go ahead and do a campaign? Because if you're trying to assess one, if you know what the challenges are, that will be very useful to you. These are not the only questions you might be asking, but these are some of the questions you might be asking. And these are the things that then get you reading, and then you can start planning. So if we move on to the quite a simple reading planning cycle, all I'm saying is that once you've got your first sets of questions, you will start reading and getting more in-depth information about what's been talked about that was relevant in the lecture. And that becomes really important. And then you'll start planning and say, I'll need to have a paragraph and I'll talk about this, and I'll have a paragraph and I'll talk about that. But then as you're kind of planning what your paragraphs are, you might spot a gap and say, or think of another question. You're thinking, well, I've said this and I've said this. I need to say something else. There's something else, which will take you back to the reading game, basically. So what you've got to remember is that reading and planning isn't linear. You don't do all the reading, then plan, then write. But be prepared to go back in a cyclical manner. Read some, plan some, go back to the reading, plan some more. And that'll be you getting closer to getting ready to start writing. And the longer you put into the reading and planning part of it, the better you make your plan, the better you really have an understanding of what you're looking for, the easier it will be to write. Because as you're reading, obviously you'll be taking notes, as I've said before, you'll be taking notes, etc., and that will be really helpful to you. Okay, so that's that. That's understanding the question, introduction to public relations. I hope that has been useful for you. If you've got any questions, obviously you can raise them in class any week at any point. Thanks.